Okay, maybe we can begin now. It really is my great pleasure to welcome Karuna Mantena, and I really mean welcome because this is Karuna's first year here at Columbia, in fact, her first semester teaching, and we're very privileged to have her among the South Asia ranks. She's a professor of political science here now, but she has been at Yale for quite a number of years as a professor of government. So it is really a feather in our cap to have Karuna make that radical move from New Haven to Morningside Heights. Karuna has published very extensively in 19th-century British imperial ideology and political thought. Her first book, Alibis of Empire, Henry Maine, and the Ends of Liberal Imagination, is a very subtle, nuanced book that explores the transformations and even the unexpected turns in British imperial ideology. More recently, she has shifted her focus to a study of Mohandas Gandhi, and she's been working on the politics of nonviolence. But I think what is quite interesting is the emphasis on the politics. And from what I have read of Karuna's work in progress, she's really kind of trying to move the focus from just talking about the morality of nonviolence and the pacifism and the philosophy of nonviolence, and reorienting our attention to the politics of nonviolence in Gandhian thought. So it is really my great pleasure to welcome her today to speak from this work in progress. And I believe this is your tentative title for the book, Gandhi's Realism, Means and Ends in Politics. So thank you, Karuna, for making space in your very busy spring semester schedule to come and talk to us.
Well, thank you very much, Gary. It's a pleasure to be here, and thank you all for many friends and some of you who have seen more than one version of some of these talks. Well, thank you for being stalwart participants in this conversation. I'll just begin. I will say one caveat is it is a tentative paper, so I'll try to end early enough that I can hear comments and questions. So I'm gonna. Some of the conclusions are still being worked out in this particular chapter. So the title of my talk is The Means and Ends of Swaraj. Soon after his release from jail in 1924. Over the annual meeting of the Indian National Congress. I think it was his only time he held the presidency. It came at a moment of intense debate for the abrupt end of the non-cooperation movement, which I'll refer to as NCO after this, had opened up sharp divisions on the future course of political action. In Gandhi's absence, the Swaraj Party formed to contest elections to the newly reformed legislative councils, reversing Congress policy on boycott. In the face of this challenge, Gandhi tried to recommit Congress to the spirit and practice of non-cooperation, albeit in a new vein. Now emphasizing its constructive orientation and capacity, Gandhi downgraded the disruptive imperative of the original program. In line with the Bardoli decision, which suspended civil disobedience in March 1922, Gandhi wanted to channel the energies of Congress workers away from satyagraha as aggressive disobedience towards building up of Swaraj from below. The boycott of courts, councils, schools, and cloth would continue, but its immediate purpose was to provide scaffolding, what he called scaffolding, for the internal reform and, quote, positive construction of national institutions. Gandhi associated the social content of Swaraj with the constructive program and its threefold emphasis on the abolition of untouchability, Hindu-Muslim unity, and the promotion of Khadi.
It was in this period that Gandhi would devise his most insistent and inventive propaganda for the constructive program, in particular for Khadi as the means of realizing what he termed Swaraj in terms of the masses. In his mind, quote, "Every spinning wheel that hums in a mud cottage is bringing us nearer to our inevitable liberation." Swaraj, in terms of the masses, required Congress, making Congress a truly mass organization. It had to, quote, "become progressively popular by shifting initiative and power to the masses." This required direct contact and identification with the rural masses, quote, "working for them and in their myths," and presenting a program in which the masses can freely participate. Khadi was that program, quote, "precisely calculated to make the poorest of India, whether men or women, conscious of their strength and make them partakers in the struggle for freedom." For the educated and privileged classes, it meant a fundamental reorientation away from seeking office and power for themselves and toward service to the masses, representing popular interests and advancing, quote, "into public life those who have hitherto kept aloof." So to effect these shifts, Gandhi introduced a provocative proposal that colloquially became known as the spinning franchise. Members of elected Congress bodies were to perform a half hour of daily hand spinning and offer a monthly contribution of 2,000 yards of hand-spun yarn upon penalty of expulsion from office. The penalty provision proved to be extremely controversial and was dramatically opposed, triggering a walkout of the leaders of the Swaraj Party upon proposal. A working compromise allowed the monthly contribution of yarn to replace the 4 anna membership fee, with office holders expected to commit to, quote, "the habitual wearing of khadi at Congress functions." By 1926, further compromises made spinning merely a voluntary alternative to the 4 anna franchise. By then, an affiliated but separate organization was formed, the All India Spinning Association, to become the main vehicle for khadi coordination and propaganda. The debates over the spinning franchise and boycott policy nearly split the party and exposed deeper political dissonances within the movement. The Swarajist view, which I think we can say came to represent the mainstream position within Congress, tended to see boycott and spinning, and more generally the constructive program, as tactics of mobilization or consciousness raising at best, rather than what Gandhi thought it was, which was the organic content of independence. In this respect, debates about tactics were part and parcel of a decade of controversy on the meaning of Swaraj itself, with Gandhi being pushed to articulate more definite positions on the means and ends of Swaraj. One such challenge along these lines asked for a revision of the Congress Creed, similar in 1924, in an effort to refocus the party on the end goal of independence. Petitioners goaded Gandhi to delete the phrase, quote, "the phrase by peaceful and legitimate means" from the Congress Creed. For the petitioners, nonviolence was too restrictive a code for a truly national organization, which ought to be as open as possible to differing opinions on political methods. More crucially, they worried that with Gandhi's fixation on means, Congress was losing sight of the political stakes of the struggle, which for them had everything to do with determining the goal of Swaraj. In their view, quote, "means are after all means, and our object and means should not be confounded with each other." The more urgent task then was the clarification of Swaraj. Specifically, the political moment demanded a declaration in, quote, "unmistakable terms that independence and complete independence is our destined goal." In their view, quote, "it was the moral force of this ideal that creates nations." In the interval between NCO and the resumption of mass disobedience in the Salt Satyagraha, the meaning of Swaraj was at the forefront of political debate. The political question of the first order was whether to declare an open and complete break with Britain. The refusal to accept even Dominion status would be the rallying cry of the Congress, culminating in the famous Purna Swaraj Resolution of 1929. Moreover, younger and more radical voices within Congress wanted the movement to forthrightly convey socialist and egalitarian commitments when defining Swaraj. In the debate on both aspects of Swaraj, Gandhi expressed considerable skepticism of placing such importance on the Declaration of Ends. To demand of Britain a confirmation of the meaning to Swaraj risked reducing politics to sloganeering and exposed the political weakness of the movement, in his view. More fundamentally for Gandhi, the debate on Swaraj was rife with confusions about the relationship of means and ends. Gathering consensus around an attachment to a particular meaning of Swaraj was being conflated in his eyes with its realization. For Gandhi, quote, the clearest possible definition of the goal and its appreciation would fail to take us there if we do not know and utilize the means of achieving it. To the petitioner's claim that, quote, means are, after all, only means, Gandhi opposed this guiding maxim, quote, means are, after all, everything. As the means, so the end. Violent means will give violent Swaraj. That would be a menace to the world and to India herself. There is no wall of separation between means and end. Indeed, the Creator has given us control, and that too very limited, over means, none over the end. Realization of the goal is in exact proportion to that of the means. To many now and then, this looked like dogmatism on means, one that inhibits more flexible political judgment on tactics of mobilization and resistance. More specifically, critics accuse Gandhi of privileging nonviolence over Swaraj, of giving precedence to his more controversial moral, spiritual, and social experiments over the political fight for independence. So today I take those two episodes just as a starting point to pause and explore the meaning of this well-known maxim associated with Gandhi that means are, after all, everything. And I want to do so from three angles. One, I want to consider what it tells us about the means and ends of Swaraj, and specifically what the place of the constructive program was, meant as the process and the fulfillment of Swaraj. Secondly, I want to consider what this emphasis on means tells us about the nature of politics more generally. One of the things that interests me in studying Gandhi's lifelong attempt to implement nonviolent politics is I think one can discern these general propositions about politics, especially in relation to the recurring practical dilemmas of politics. These, I think, for Gandhi included an assessment of the sources and temptation of violence and domination in politics, the tendencies for escalation and retrenchment in political contestation, and more generally, an attunement to the psychological obstacles to persuasive political action. These, I think, are what you can read as the correlative or theoretical underpinnings of a politics of nonviolence. And so then you can also, as I argue in other chapters and more obliquely in this one, to see how nonviolence or satyagraha as the correlative force and orientation that is meant to limit and mitigate the negative affective dynamics of political action to effect progressive and persuasive change. And the third angle, so that's my orientation, I'll come back to it. The third angle I want to do is also take this opportunity to interrogate the conceptual language of means and ends. And here what I'll try to offer is I'm going to give you maybe more than you ever wanted examples of how Gandhi understood means and ends, how he formulated it, what practical examples he gave. And I'll try to give some clarity and classification to these varied meanings and what they imply, I think, and try to make sense of them in terms of what they illuminate about the central dilemmas of politics. And so in generally what I'm trying to do here is clarify the political valence of the means ends questioning Gandhi by connecting it to his an account of the inherent dilemmas of political action. So means and ends were theoretical terms ubiquitous in Gandhi's political thought. Unlike the language of rights and duties, which Gandhi occasionally turned to, I think the language of means and ends is something more authentic to Gandhi's thinking. It was something he continually returned to, reworked, and extended over time. It also is, in some ways, a conceptual language that bridges developments in Indian and Western political thinking at the time. I suspect, and I have to still work through this, I think its pervasiveness in Gandhi originally stemmed in part from his reading of the Gita and generally in the discussion around modern interpretations of the Gita that were reinventing karma yoga as a model of selfless and disinterested political action. Likewise, the means-ends question framed a wide-ranging debate on mass political action amongst Marxists, existentialists, progressive thinkers, anarchists, and anti-colonial thinkers and activists. idea of a mutual interdependence of means and ends has become a core feature of theories of nonviolent politics ever since Gandhi. Martin Luther King, building on Richard Gregg, but you can also think of theorists like Joan Bondurant, consistently argued that in nonviolent direct action, the means and ends must cohere, that moral and constructive ends required equally moral and pure means. It's a trope almost of nonviolent thinkers on nonviolence. But I think what is distinctive in Gandhi's formulations is that he seems to go beyond notions of mutuality or reciprocity between means and ends to propose something like the outright priority of means. This has led interpreters such as Raghavan Iyer to remark that, quote, in his extreme moral preoccupation with the means, Gandhi might indeed stand alone. But whereas Iyer presented this dramatic emphasis on means and as part and parcel of Gandhi's moral absolutism, an absolutism that Iyer defends, nonviolence is the only truthful and pure means, I approach the question in almost inverse terms. Rather than a moralist injunction, the priority afforded to means by Gandhi, I will argue, or at least indicate, or start arguing, I'm not sure I'll finish the argument, I think can be framed as a realist demand for the heightened scrutiny of means and in their ethical and political implications. So Gandhi said, quote, he never believed that the end justified the means. In this, he was a consistent opponent of the logic of pure expediency in politics. Quote, the connection between the end and the means was so intimate that one could not, quote, achieve a good end by bad means. What drove Gandhi in this conviction was his worry that modern politics had become saturated by a kind of pure instrumentalism in which violence and force had become widely permissible and explicitly defended as legitimate. This slide into instrumentalism was also at the core of Gandhi's repeated insinuations against Bal Gangadhar Tilak that his approach to politics followed the maxim of tit for tat. Tilak bristled at this and insisted that what he aimed for was not amoral politics, but followed Krishna's command to meet wickedness with wickedness over Gandhi's assertion of Buddhist ahimsa. In his words, this is Tilak's words, both were, quote, equally honest and righteous, but the one is more suited to this world than the other. Gandhi argued that Tilak's logic was in its own way an imitation of Western tactics and methods, repeating the argument from Gandhian Swaraj. For Gandhi, the most devastating and profound legacy of imperialism was that in their emulation of the West, the oppressed had come to recognize and legitimate force as a fundamental principle of the social order. But in some ways, Tilak was right in terms of probably right that his own defense was not a defense of a pure political realism, but more a morally argued sense of righteous action. And in a way that also shows that the primary support of what Gandhi called, quote, the age-long superstition that the ends justify the means was not a prosaic Machiavellianism or amoral defenders of power politics, but in fact political idealists for whom right motives and noble ends could be used to enable, justify, or redeem the use of dubious political means. Much of Gandhi's political thinking is, I think, more directly animated by a continual worry about the potential for violence given in idealist enthusiasms, from militant nationalism, aggressive religious revivalism, to various forms of revolutionary Marxism that shape the ideological landscape of Indian anti-colonial politics. While these true patriots could be admired for, quote, their selflessness, defiance of death, and love of country, right motives could not excuse actions, quote, if they are bad and harmful to society. Gandhi often suggested that, quote, the largest amount of harm done in this world is by people who have good motives, but who do not hesitate to resort to acts that are bad. It is the political idealist who is most tempted to sever the relationship between means and ends. In refusing to understand that ends are, quote, always the direct consequence of the means, they effectively denigrate the problem of means. For Gandhi, then, the characteristic failing of political idealism is a resolute focus on ends at the expense of means. The focus on an exaltation of ends and the concomitant indifference to means was to open the door to violence. The more righteous and just the sought-for ideal seemed, the easier to justify the violence necessary to secure them. This was in part why Bolshevism, Gandhi argued, believed, quote, in, or relied too much on, quote, short, violent cuts to success. For Gandhi, this was also a psychological dynamic, the attachment to ideals, the belief that ideals were true and their motives true had an unwittingly permissive effect on means. Passionate attachment to ends, what he referred to as the hankering after ends, engendered turmoil and impatience which tempted one in the direction of dangerous means. The temptation to use any and all available means for even small or temporary gains seemingly becomes greater in proportion to one's belief in an attachment to ends. The denigration of means for Gandhi led to a more straightforward political impotence. To ignore means was to be ignorant of the practical mechanisms of political change. At issue here was also a basic confusion about the nature of politics. This is what comes to light in the various debates that Gandhi staged vis-à-vis his Congress colleagues on the meaning of Swaraj. The political debate on Swaraj had revealed a prominent idealist streak that saw the clarification of ideals as crucial for political radicalization and mobilization. It was the starting point of politics. For Gandhi, however, generating enthusiasm for ends was being confused with their fulfillment. Quote, "We have enthusiasm, we also have good ideals, but these will not ensure us our freedom. They will not bring us what we seek. Our deeds alone will go with us and decide the shape of the future. If we do not translate our enthusiasm into action and see that it yields excellent results, it will have been to no purpose." Gandhi would insist that rousing speeches were no substitute for action. When speech-making becomes a substitute for action, it betrays a weakness of position, a reactive stance that aims to expose the opponent's aims to expose the opponent's shortcomings rather than building true strength from within. In short, for Gandhi, in politics, quote, "one should practice rather than preach. Swaraj could never be won by speeches. It will be secured only through action." This conviction was at the core of Gandhi's fixation on the question of means. Especially after Chare Chara and the end of non-cooperation, Gandhi, I think, especially emphasized and cultivated what I'd call a means orientation to politics as the necessary and appropriate response to the dilemmas of action. So for the rest of the talk, I'm going to try to get into more conceptual detail and focus on three broad ways that Gandhi presents the relationship of means and ends, and then I'll try to connect them specifically to his defense or articulation of the constructive program in particular. And these three ways I will describe as I'll go into more detail, but the first is where means as ends, so a kind of direct equivalence or reciprocity. The second, a means towards an end, which I'll broadly describe as more strategic. And finally, defense of means as such, which I'll describe as in a tactical sense. So, probably one of the more well-known aphorisms of Gandhi on means is the assertion that means and ends are convertible terms in my philosophy of life. Here, I think we have what I call means as ends, or a really strict equivalence. So one might even say, as Gandhi does, a reversibility. So means are ends, and ends are means. There's no distinction between them. I think this foregrounds a form of action in which the principle or purpose or end of an act is realized in the act itself. Ends are understood as goals, where each and every act contains, performs, entails the end. We might think of this as action that is self-sufficient. The end is expressed and realized in the act. I think when we think of the coincidence of means in this way, in this tight way, we're thinking of action as expressive or exemplary, where action itself is endowed with a powerful performative function. I think these kinds of actions, there are two aspects I'll focus on. I think this kind of action always, one in which the end or ideal is implicated or expressed in Gandhi, always involves a kind of self-work or self-cultivation, an ethical practice or practice. or practices. And of course, this is central to almost all of Gandhian action in Satyagraha. All forms are built up around notions of self-work. So in some sense, all of them have this element, but the ones I think that are real models of this kind of immediacy or expressiveness is, of course, Swaraj as a model of self-mastery is one that's tied to acts of self-making and an immediate site for the real self-realization and self-transformation. In Hind Swaraj, when Gandhi's response to colonial self-enslavement was precisely to call forth practices of self-recovery and self-mastery, where the cultivation of self-mastery was a kind of moral and psychological awakening. And this, so there is a kind of attitudinal shift in this, I think, in the perfect ideas of means as ends. In Gandhi's early writing and campaigns, this connection was made between Satyagraha and effecting a kind of attitudinal shift while practicing. So he would argue the primary purpose of Satyagraha was to allow ordinary Indians to overcome fear and realize dignity and self-respect by recovering their agency, or what Gandhi called the power of action through Satyagraha. And here I think both, again, the idea of Swaraj as a process of similar to Swaraj as a process of psychological overcoming, and of course Gandhi's famous insistence that, quote, the very attempt at Swaraj was an expression of Swaraj. That once you orient yourself to the goal of freedom, you've already achieved it in some form. This again was a psychological attitudinal shift that each individual would have to take and experience for each themselves. Again, in Hind Swaraj, Gandhi contended that true self-rule or freedom had to be truly self-determining. Quote, such Swaraj has to be experienced by each for himself. Swaraj was not a gift that others could grant. Everyone will have to take it for himself. And again, I think this was another reason why Satyagraha was to be a mass form or universal. Everyone must be given this chance to act and realize themselves in action. Ultimately, collective Swaraj was built upon these individual acts of self-transformation or self-reorientation. I think in this regard, Gandhian action is you can think of this as a feature of a general feature of more radical political action. So when the ends at issue are closely tied to self-transformation, which I think applies to a wide variety of goals, from the recovery and realization of agency, identity, dignity, freedom, political action takes on a strong existential and expressive function. I think you can see this across the activists and thinkers across the 20th century, thinkers of action from Marxists to existentialists, and especially in theories of nonviolence, which are concerned with realizing the moral and political agency of oppressed people, and are especially concerned about how to bring people unaccustomed to seeing themselves as political agents into the political sphere. So whether this action is individual or collective, violent or nonviolent, there's a variety of strains of theories of action that, when the issue at stake is the question of what kinds of action can overcome things like inherited deference, fear, or docility to realize the psychological ends of liberation, they're working with a notion of exemplary or expressive, or a notion of action in which means and ends are simultaneous. So one aspect of this first form of means as ends that I wanted to focus on is self-work, or some ways in which it works through the vehicle of the self. I think the other, which I've already implied, is when means or ends or means, it also implies temporal immediacy. Some people think of this as prefiguration. I'm often not sure, because I think prefiguration has a temporality still in some ways. But I think what's attractive about immediacy is, again, this when we think of means as ends, these forms of action where means appear simultaneous at ends, for Gandhi, and I'll get to the constructive program, you can think that these are forms of action that are supposed to immediately start bringing into form a new society via experimentation with new ways of being. This is, I think, partially captured and diluted, or we might say distorted, in the common slogan we hear today of "Be the Change," which has a very long history of not being exactly a statement that Gandhi made. But I think the key point about what Gandhian action, when it talks about prefiguration, is or being the change, is that the action is not, the important thing is that the action is not expressive of personal commitment, but is linked to a wider set of a transformation of social relationships. So something like this notion of, I'll still call it prefiguration, is, I think, central to Gandhi's framing of the constructive program as the means and ends of Swaraj. He's repeatedly calls it its fulfillment would be the fulfillment of Swaraj. The constructive program was, of course, a national campaign to effect internal reform and experiment with new social and the social and institutional foundations of Swaraj. Swaraj's self-mastery was, I think, what Gandhi implied in Swaraj's self-mastery was also a constitution of new relations of voluntary authority through the creation of these self-sufficient or free institutions. The idea, of course, was to undo practices of domination and build up alternative practices of equality through voluntary connection. And in this way, Gandhi again conceived of individual Swaraj and collective Swaraj as isomorphic. Constructive work contained and entailed the end of Swaraj. Through these everyday acts of curing its own ills, India would attain and sustain self-rule. In the period of the debate on the social content of Swaraj, when it came to fore, Gandhi, I think, began to insist, again, as I implied in the beginning, he insisted repeatedly on the need to build up this social content by experimenting with immediate deeds, work, the language of deeds, work, action, as opposed to speeches or providing blueprints. The key was that, again, these deeds, while national in scope, were local and individual and conceived in the language of work and service. So constructive work was supposed to be a here and now, immediate undoing of practices of domination in the language of service. And it was through this sort of transformation of everyday relations, which was also a transformation of self. So let's just take the example of Khadi very quickly. Of course, Khadi was, on its own terms, Gandhi called it a practice of Swaraj. It was the essence of building up new institutions to which you would obey, and in that sense, an instance of freedom. So in an interview with N.K. Bose, he said, through Khadi, we teach the people the art of civil disobedience to an institution which they have built up for themselves. It's a training for action, a mastery of self, a training for satyagraha, but more crucially as a prefiguration for Swaraj. It was an act of moral imaginations, or a work of moral psychological change. The acts of constructive work were meant to link the rich and poor. The labor of Khadi was supposed to be a project of universality, as well as an act of identification. It was meant for the elite to unlearn and undo privilege, and therefore connected to a demand to undertake labor that was traditionally assigned to lower and excluded classes. For the poor, it was a way to demonstrate a solidarity, but also exemplify forms of discipline, courage, and sacrifice to be emulated. And it was also for Gandhi a form of persuasion. A service was supposed to show sincerity and win allegiance. This, of course, was akin to the language of service and atonement he would use in the 30s and 40s around anti-untouchability work. And it was also a language he used around the question of Hindu-Muslim unity, though Gandhi always thought that it was one of the main tragedies of Hindu-Muslim unity, or his attempt to invoke it, was that he, after the 20s, he found it very difficult to find a set of immediate practices that could institute or encourage or encourage or resonate in a way that he thought he had found with something like Khadi. So this, I think, was a way, so there was something, I think this was the importance of what Gandhi meant by practical idealism in action, that the temporal here and now was the time of action. He was deeply suspicious of a deferral of this kind of social work to another time or to another external agent. So of course, this meant so the demand for immediate action was that the social content of Swaraj was also part of this self-work of daily transforming relations. You could not wait for state action or a distant law in order to enact these social transformations. And I think this was also part of the critique of the temporality of traditional accounts of political consciousness and mobilization or education, in which that mobilization is made in the name of a future top-down program. This connects to the second idea of means, which I will call means towards ends, which is, I think, a more strategic orientation than strictly an intrinsic one like the first. Of course, it's connected because I think here too, but the emphasis I will give here is there's a connection of cultivation and prefiguration and experimentation, but here I think the key is the means of ends of Swaraj are understood in more the relation in collective terms. So analogous to the first, there is of course an interest in forms of political action that have an inherent connection to political ends, but here I think again the scale is collective, it's expanded and takes place over time. This is what introduces strategic dimension and a layer of strategic judgment. Means and ends are posited as interdependent, but in a manner that assumes disjuncture and distance. So if we take the crucial 15th chapter of Gandhian Swaraj, where a lot of these parables or ideas of means and ends are first introduced, Gandhi offers this famous organic metaphor, I think, to capture this kind of strategic interdependence. Your belief that there is no connection between the means and the end is a great mistake. Through that mistake, even men who have been considered religious committed grievous crimes. Your reasoning is the same as saying that we can get a rose through planting a noxious weed. The means may be likened to a seed, the end to a tree, and there is just the same inviolable connection between the means and the end as there is between the seed and the tree. We reap exactly as we sow. At one level, this organic analogy is akin to, I think, the expressive, exemplary, or prefigurative model. The means contains germ-like, in nascent form, the principle or end. But there is an extended temporality. Gandhi still insists that there's no dividing line between means and ends, but here the emphasis is on the notion that ends are direct consequences of means. It's not that they embody them. So I think this assumes a non-coincidence, again, where strategic judgment becomes more paramount. To put it in the organic terms, the seed is not yet the tree. It may anticipate or point towards an end, but it is not yet its fulfillment. And Gandhi often talks about the seed needing to disintegrate in order to become the tree, which might have other implications. But here what matters is how one cultivates or conserves the seed. Means require continuous attention, cultivation, protection. In a more strategic language, it would be carefully choosing, calculating, and experimenting with proper means to build towards the right end. Choice matters, for it is the choice of means that defines, shapes, and changes the character of the ends. This language of protection, cultivation, preservation, I think, are everywhere in Gandhi, and in fact, at some point he calls himself instead, not again, a phrase he likes, he starts often by saying, I'm not a saint or visionary, but a practical idealist. Another common phrase, which directly he says, I'm not a saint or visionary, but a common gardener who cultivates and preserves and protects. Again, in a famous letter to Nehru, he says, you have emphasized the necessity of a clear statement of the goal. This is Swaraj. But having once determined it, I've never attached importance to the repetition. The clearest possible definition of the goal and its appreciation will fail to take us there if we do not know and utilize the means of achieving it. I have, therefore, concerned myself principally with the conservation of the means and their progressive use. So in the debate on Swaraj, Gandhi would repeatedly emphasize the importance of focusing on ways and means, how to organize the action that will shape and build towards this right end. And it was alongside this endless, repetitive criticizing of focus on speech, blueprints, or enthusiasm, as opposed to deeds, work, and service. So here I think there are two examples that he'd focus on trying to think, what does it mean then in a strategic terms to the means, what would the means and ends of Swaraj mean in this strategic sense? On one hand, I think it's the emphasis in Satyagraha where Gandhi insists that Swaraj and Satyagraha is not about or can't be attained by rousing speeches or enthusiasm again, but displaying strength through deeds. And in Satyagraha, I think this meant that a disciplined Satyagraha on a mass scale was what demonstrated organizational capacity. It embodied the capacity, again, for a kind of collective self-mastery, and hence was a prefiguration or demonstration or fulfillment of Swaraj. To demand Purna Swaraj, as everyone had been wanting to do throughout the 20s, but for Gandhi, had to be matched and backed by some sort of show of collective strength, unless otherwise it was just demanding things through words and exposing weakness without a kind of strength. So of course the question was always what did Gandhi mean by strength? And I think in this sense it was these various displays of capacity for self-rule. In terms of the social content of Swaraj, Gandhi would, in the critique of, the call in the 20s was, of course, the demand was for Purna Swaraj and the demand to restart something like a non-cooperation movement, which Gandhi was very reluctant to do for a number of reasons, but I think, again, one of the key reasons was you can't demand without showing that you have the strength to back up that demand. So the anxiety there was to choose enthusiasm or passion, the rousing speech, over strength through deeds. In terms of the social content of Swaraj, Gandhi was most critical of what he thought is the need for blueprints or definitions of the future goal of Swaraj, and confusing that for its realization. So this, he repeated, and I'll give you a couple of them, but hopefully not too many, of why definitions of goals are not the same as actions. And again, he wanted to sharply differentiate deeds, work, service from mere enthusiasm and definitions. So here I'll give one account. Here, I have never sought to delude Indian opinion into the belief that a definition of purpose, however plainly stated, would of itself, by the enunciation of a phrase, provide a solution for problems which have to be solved before that purpose is fully realized. The assertion of a goal, however precise its terms, is of necessity a different thing from the goal's attainment. No sensible traveler would feel that a clear definition of his destination was the same thing as the completion of his journey. There were a lot of metaphors around maps and travel in this. Defining Swaraj in advance will not lead to its realization, and in fact it might actually be counterproductive. The real definition will be determined by our action, the means we adopt to achieve the goal. If we would but concentrate upon the means, Swaraj will take care of itself. This is again why our primary task should be discovering the ways and means. So here, I think Gandhi's emphasis on the strategic link was that mental attitude and commitment was not enough, mobilization was not enough without some connection with specific forms of positive action. When we consider the practical attempts at prefigurations, again, the constructive program and the organization of Khadi, I think we can see a great deal of Gandhi judging or figuring out a great deal of his own strategic judgment and thinking about how to make the project innovative, imaginative, and experimental, and that it required a constant readjustment if these forms were going to authentically or genuinely prefigure the end of Swaraj. For such actions to shape the end, Swaraj, they needed to reveal the agent's capacity to enact in the here and now this alternative future. And it both demonstrated realizability, but also could judge whether these are in fact effectively solving the problems to which they're meant to. So, and finally, I think so one emphasis was for him, emphasis on deeds and service was what makes Swaraj realizable as such. But it also was a way to test whether this Swaraj was effectively mirroring this alternative form of Swaraj that Gandhi always imagined. So we know from very early on, Gandhi's account of Swaraj was always meant to be non-statist, non-elitist, and I think populist, and ideally formed around a notion of village democracy. And so there obviously was in his mind, of course, the reason constructive Swaraj was a mirror of it wasn't just a technique. There was a substantive image of what that Swaraj would look like. Now, finally, I'm going to turn to what I call the third form of understanding of means, which is means as such, which I take to be almost a purely tactical understanding. I think this is the most elusive and maybe the most original form. So I think tactical in the sense that the choice of means for Gandhi shaped the terms of political contestation. So again, I take the tactical understanding of means. You can also think of it as a tactical face of satyagraha is meant on the one hand to counteract the hazards of action, and on the other to positively alter the dynamics of contestation to effect progressive change. Some of this is connected to a basic, what I think is a deeper skeptical or a counter ontology of action that Gandhi adheres to. And I'll just say a little about this, where you get a sense of it in these description of means and ends when he repeatedly refers to the idea that we do not know or cannot know or control our distant ends. So if I go back to the first formulation, they say means are after all means. I would say means are after all everything. At the end of that, he says there is no wall of separation between means and ends. But the important point, indeed, the Creator has given us control, and that too very limited over means, none over the end. Realization of the goal is in exact proportion to that of means. So here, I think, is a key. I think the more when Gandhi asserts that we have little control over ends, this is part and part of the strongest insistence on the absolute priority of means over ends, precisely because we have no access to ends. So in another formulation, Gandhi contends that we can never really know our distant goal. Quote, for it will be determined again by not by our definitions, but by our acts. If we are wise, we will take care of the present, and the future will take care of itself. God has only given us a limited sphere of action and a limited vision. Sufficient unto the day is the good thereof. This understanding, I think, bears the template of an underlying theory of karma, of an account of ethical causation in which chains of intentionality and responsibility reverberate in unforeseen and extreme ways. I don't think Gandhi deduced his theory of action from a theory of karma, but I think it's expressed analogically. Is that right? Analogically, that's the word. In the general portrayal of action as, again, enmeshed in this irreversible, unmasterable, unknowable chain of cause and effect. One final quote, every action brings in its result, and in the mysterious scheme of things where fibers are so interwoven that the trunk is not distinguishable from the branches, who can identify the fruits of one man's action amidst the complex of the collective acts of many persons? It is enough to know that action necessarily brings results. So my gloss on this is that it is enough to know that our actions have consequences, and Gandhi is asking us to focus on that to minimize their potential for negative effects and potential for harm and suffering. So this is what I think of as means as pure tactics. The negative side, it limits negative affect as well. It wards off temptations of excess in ourselves and our opponents. And this is its purpose is to mitigate the negative dynamics of action and contestation. And I think this is also why I would read when Gandhi demands, this is where I think you'd put in the demand to cultivate indifference to the fruits of action, a common refrain from the Gita. And here I think Gandhi means it as a moral psychological claim about how to constrain the passions and attachment that tempt one to undertake impatient or dangerous or destructive means. Renunciation of the fruits of action, Gandhi states, quote, in no way means indifference to the result, nor attention to the results that are expected to follow. Rather, renunciation of the desire to attain the cherished end concerns the hankering after fruit, the brooding that causes one to lose one's focus and nerve and leads to the distracted, impatient desire for immediate results. So to cultivate indifference is a way to ward off the negative effects of hankering. It's a psychological lesson about, and I think the flip side is the focus on the on immediate work is what allows for this cultivation of indifference. So if you focus on the immediacy of constructive work, you also the centrality of work and service, this is a way to work on the passion. So Gandhi says Khadi again is the great example of taking the time to cultivate inwardness. It is a way, as he says, quote, that can control or temper our passion and anger. And in this sense, it allows for a certain kind of preparation for Satyagraha as well as Swaraj. So if you bring some of these aspects together, I think, again, what mattered, why deeds and service mattered over enthusiasm over ideals or blueprints for Swaraj, was for Gandhi the most difficult task of Swaraj was specifying the means that in practice both creates the shared interest in Swaraj and shows the capacity to build and shape it. The immediate and what he often called the silent work of construction not only paves the way towards Swaraj, but does so because it can act as a bulwark against the disappointments, impatience, and impotence that underwrite the psychology of shortcuts or exemplary violence. So I want to just end with a few conclusions, that some which I've implied and some which I've not proven, but I hope at some point in the work to incorporate. So I would like to would really like to get your feedback. So part of the reason I gave this very extended account of means and ends, and I wanted to extend it, I think often the language of means and ends in theories of nonviolence as well is most theorized as prefigurative or expressive or exemplary of the first kind of means as ends. And I wanted to add this strategic and tactical phase, and part of the reason I wanted to do that is because I think it's there in Gandhi, but I also think there's something genuinely compelling in the ways that Gandhian action considers the outward effects of inwardly oriented actions. So that I think Gandhi thinks through what the political effects of practices of ethical cultivation can be in mass politics. Often to talk of the outward effects of inward politics, I think many are concerned that this is has too much of a instrumentalizing language, and that. But I think what I hope to show eventually is that there is a way to talk about strategic purpose without implying instrumentalization, and I think this is in Gandhian action. This is because the agent of action is always the self, and action is always funneled through work on the self, and it's only when one abstracts from that I think you get problems of instrumentalization. Also, I think Gandhi is often described either as disinterested in efficacy, or when described as a practical politician, he becomes a savvy and manipulative Machiavellian. And so what I am trying to do is also that there is something compelling because he's neither a perfect saint in everything or a perfect a pure moralist in politics, but also that there are principles that guide the relationship between means and ends such that it isn't just a pure flexibility. And it's in that vein that efficacy becomes, I think, more interesting. Finally, I think this way of, there are many, I think, problems with the traditional way that the question of means and ends are understood, mostly in political theory. In that debate on means and ends normally pits so-called political realists who believe in flexibility above everything against so-called absolutists who advocate restrictive moral limits on political action. And in that conventional framing, the means-ends debate tends to focus on moral dilemmas about the corruption and complicity of the actor, the so-called dirty hands problem, or on the other hand, on the justification of violence. In the latter case especially, I think what looks like a debate on means actually resolves into a debate on ends, on which ends can or should justify the recourse to violence or more broadly coercive means. Realists tend to defend the necessity of violence without ever specifying when and why it would work. And as such, I think the realist-moralist debate evades or avoids a deep engagement with the question of means as a political dilemma of what means actually do in politics, or in Gandhi's terms, means in their implications. And finally, I've been calling this sense that Gandhi places extreme priority on means. I often call it a kind of means orientation to politics. And here I think of it as obviously not as a dogmatic or absolutist insistence on one means, and partially this is because nonviolence or satyagraha, in Gandhi's terms, was a broad, it described a broad set of actions. It didn't give you a simple code of what to do. And I think, but to me, what is interesting, I think some of the theoretical or practical lessons that Gandhi conveys about the need to cultivate this means orientation is, I think, one that orients us. In a way, the reason we need a means orientation is because it's the necessary and maybe appropriate response to his understanding of the inherent dilemmas of action. So the concentration on means or means orientation is what would awaken, in Gandhi's terms, a steadier idealism, a practical idealism that has a more clear-eyed focus on the demands and implications of action. So again, and I'll end on this, but for the goal of Swaraj, concentrating on constructive work, deeds, and service would offset and mitigate the psychological instabilities of political action, as well as allow for practical experimentation with the organic content of Swaraj. So I'll end there.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Karuna. This is just a really rich and just a beautifully nuanced talk. I'm sure there are lots of questions, and Karuna, I think you're also you'd be interested in getting
comments, questions. Yeah, please.
Yeah, Nani.
I hesitate.
Let me also introduce, because since Karuna is so new. Lenny, just a minute. I just want to, as various speakers speak, it might be helpful if you could also introduce yourself, because Karuna is so new in our midst.
One thing I've always wondered about, and I think it's Gandhi's fault and not yours, is the slipperiness between Swaraj as a political, social, collective goal of some kind, and as individual self-fulfillment, as you've explained. That's one question. The other question I wanted to put is, as far as my listening went, you mentioned two other people briefly in one sentence, Tilak and Nehru.
Yeah.
And I'm quite familiar with the writings of a number of Indian nationalists. So I wondered, who is Gandhi debating with? You mentioned at the beginning there was a debate in the 1920s about Swaraj. Who are the other people? Is he debating with himself, explicating his own thoughts? Who are the other debaters from whatever you want to take it, to independence? Who is he interchanging with? Because I don't think that a lot of other Indian nationalists were really into this the way your man is here. They wanted to get to the political goal, which they, I think, would formulate in a rather simple way as Karuna Swaraj. And they were not spending this time debating.
That's right. Yeah, so I think I can answer the second one first, is I think I think he took I mean, I think most intimate debate was almost always with both the Nehrus in various ways as representative of a position that he could engage with. But I think you're right. Basically, everyone was arguing for Purna Swaraj, and he was trying to resist the obsession, what he thought the obsession with Purna Swaraj. He thought that was what the he thought this was the demand from 25 to 29, and he thought, in his mind, of course, his alternative demand was focused on constructive program, focused especially on Qadi in that period, and he kept trying to show the difference between what a politics that focused on the constructive program required, implied, represented, and again, the language he used there was a Swaraj in terms of the masses. So it was here, I think, with a clear and anti-elitist sense, and that continued. I mean, that was in Hind Swaraj as well. That Swaraj had to be a different kind, and so I do think they were amorphous in the sense that. I mean, they were not amorphous, they were everyone. So it was every debate in Congress was about the focus on specifying and delineating first two things, that it had to be, Swaraj had to be something that was not just dominion status, but in pure independence. And then, of course, the push was from the left to specify the content. There was also a demand to specify the content of Swaraj as more socialist. And Gandhi also had a debate on what both the dangers of a extreme specification of Swaraj was. So Gandhi, of course, was accused of not giving. He wanted to keep, in one sense, the goal of Swaraj more open, in the sense of the language of Swaraj more open. And one of the ways he would, so this quote that I partially gave was the debate with Nehru, which was after the Purna Swaraj resolution was enacted. And Gandhi said, you know, the problem with the way it specifies in the Lahore Congress was not just that it specifies a goal of land reform, and it specifies the interest who Congress was going to dispossess, namely the landlords and large landholders, and Gandhi says, and feudal holdings, and Gandhi says, those are obviously the interests we're going to attack. I agree with you, that's going to have to happen. But if we name them as our enemies, then they will automatically not ally with us. And right now we should keep the definition vague in some sense, because we need all parties to agree, or we have to give them a reason to be attracted to it, and later the content. So that is a more tactical account of why extreme specification of the ideal, it can be has adverse effects. But I also think he thinks the extreme specification, the need for extreme specification is because you think you'll mobilize more people because of it. And of course, Gandhi is very suspicious of a kind of mobilization, or again, either enthusiasm or mobilization, which is more about intensity than he thinks commitment or strength. So I think you're right. And you know, in the chapter, I try to be more specific, because I do think it is important to restage the debate, is partially to get a sense of what Gandhi's debating against. So I hope to do that more. But I do think he is alone in trying to articulate an alternative account of what the priority of political action should be. I mean, very few people agree with Gandhi that constructive program should be prioritized, and Gandhi will insist on that repeatedly. So the first question, I'll just, that's a very important and interesting question. So on the relationship between the collective goal of Swaraj and the individual goal, I mean, I do think Gandhi, the phrase that he uses from after Hind Swaraj is, and he repeats in various ways, is collective Swaraj Swaraj, national Swaraj, or Swaraj is going to be the addition of all of these individual Swaraj. So I do think there is a different, that to me is also a way in which Gandhi's idea of a collective is always a very individuated one, and it's less one where you have a notion of accretion or collective agency. So I do think, so I think in that way he does often, I feel like he can square the circle there, because he does think that ultimately Swaraj is one, again, especially if you think it's attitudinal form, it's one in which you have realized your power of action, which is agency, and you can see yourself as an agent that, and not a victim, and you can become an agent that aims towards self-reliance or self-mastery. Now, obviously, the outward realization of that, he does think, is a collective project. That's what the collective program is supposed to do, because you have to eradicate poverty, and you have to do other things to actually have everyone, the most vulnerable citizens, actually realize that kind of capacity. But I think there is an analogy between. There's both an analogy between individual self-mastery and collective self-mastery, but I think, again, you can see the means by which you realize is various forms of individual self-mastery. So I do think, because of the way the way in which each individual has to both realize and practice and maybe build up these rituals, is a way in which, to me, I feel like there is a more direct causal connection between individual self-mastery and collective self-mastery.
Yes, I'd like to just push on that a little bit, because it's hard to avoid the idea that he really had ended up with a personality cult that collapsed after his death. Because after all, nonviolence, satyagraha is really not anything like nonviolence. It's gripping the truth. And he says, truth is harder than adamant and softer than a flower. And so what it really means is he has complete tactical freedom. And when he wants to negotiate, its truth is softer than a flower. And when he wants to start a movement, it's harder than adamant. And if he says that everybody needs to develop themselves through spinning khadi, well, what is the... Right. He wants you to come to your own conclusions. He doesn't want to be dictatorial, but he also wants them to be the same as his conclusions. So somebody like Tagore, who doesn't want to spin khadi and wants to develop his self differently, it's very hard for Gandhi, with his absolute commitment to action and means, it's very hard for him to accommodate that sort of self-fashioning that really ought to be available to people under his own system.
Yes, this was Tagore's critique of Gandhi's, that in the name of individuality, Gandhi was enforcing a kind of conformity, especially around the wearing of khadi. So I think it's right up to a point. I mean, I think Gandhi is dogmatic on khadi, especially in the 30s and 40s. There's a long debate where people ask, people who are friends of his, if you really want to find a set of practices that are bottom up, couldn't you also focus on things like the technical development of farming or something like that? Like, why if the point is partially an economic problem of development and self-reliance and a solution to rural poverty and unemployment, which was the economic justification of khadi, I think the way in which Gandhi became absolutely insistent that khadi was the only way all the way to the end, there is a dogmatism to it. But I don't think in principle, so I think it's right that Gandhi is dogmatic when he decides on what that program is. But I think if you look at the other side, the other justifications of khadi was, I think, these other interesting attempts to find a symbolic, unifying practice of labor that can incite the imagination in some form and do this other imaginative work about the rich and the poor, the urban and the rural. And I think So I think if he could find another language for another, again, he could. So I think there's still the reason he insisted on Khadi was I think not just for its economic benefits, but for these others. And I think Tagore was certainly right in Gandhi's. I think it's certainly right that Gandhi did the model of political action described here is very demanding. I mean, no matter what. It's a constant striving, it's a constant work, and it's a constant need to, again, I think the really deep thought is if you believe in producing a radically new society, then the thing we have to really watch out is that political action leads to disappointment, to psychological instabilities. And I think Gandhi was very aware that that was something for long-term political action you needed to attend to. And so Tagore, didn't think politics was a necessary feature of everyone's life, and Gandhi did. So,
Shudipta?
I wanted to ask you a question about enthusiasm. I found it very interesting. First is just a technical point. Does he use the term enthusiasm often? And secondly, if he writes, when he writes in Gujarati, what would be, let us say, if you know, probably it's a question which should be asked to people like Tridi, what kind of term would he use? Because, I think there is a very important point there, because it seems to me that what he is saying is that there can be two types of action when you want revolutionary change in society. One kind of action is associated with resoluteness.
Right.
That you are attentive to the next step that you are doing. You should be careful that it doesn't produce harm, because you can see it clearly.
Yes.
It's not a big leap into the unknown, right? And so you can keep a control over that,
right?
And for that you need self-mastery.
Yeah.
So the crowd, when people are together, they are not a crowd. They are not actually egging each other on. Because if they have to face the British, they should not actually take shelter, in the size of the crowd, so that if the power of injustice comes at you, then you should be able to take it, even if you're alone. So I think looking at Gandhi's understanding of the collective is very interesting. But I wanted to ask you this question that, is he saying that, there is something which is spasmodic in revolutionary action? At certain points you are driven by enthusiasm and you are able to achieve something that you did not expect that you would achieve.
Yes.
But that actually leaves you unprepared in a situation where you do not have mastery over the situation yourself. So that's why he is playing, resoluteness against intensity. Is that the upward party?
So I think that's true, although I'm trying to figure out if enthusiasm is the name for that, and I'm not sure. So I think you're right that...
Is he familiar with the enthusiasm discussion in the West?
No, I don't think it's a huge... I know, I think to me, that's what interests me about the word, because it does seem to be doing something functionally equivalent to a very old 18th century onwards discussion of enthusiasm and its dangers. But, so I have to figure out the origins of... So I do think... So he does use enthusiasm a lot, especially in specific periods. So again... talking here about the problem of speeches and mobilization. So but he sometimes uses it in collective exuberance, but not uniformly. So I do think, so the reason I have to find the original term is I do think it's also the term he uses for excitement in the sense of bodily excitement. So I suspect the term is coming from there for him, from a much more Indic account of that which is uncontrollable.
It's a loss of self-control.
Quite literally, which isn't the same genealogy as the Western one, but it does function equivalently. So I think that's interesting. So I have to think more about whether that then connects to. So I think the account of revolutionary action, I don't think he means it, I have to see, often it's the language of, of the, he calls it violence. So it's the agent of revolutionary violence or martyrdom is the carrier of needs, and in very early on, you know, in the account of Hind Swaraj and the account of Madan Lal Dhingra, it is someone who is excited by ideas, and excited, and therefore it is not a clear-eyed, careful assessment. Sometimes it's also, and that I think it's also that once you deliver the act, then the justification of the act, all these other things become a part of the necessity. The other, I think, is, so some is just excitation, uncontrollable, and others it's ego, it's a kind of ego attachment, which yeah, but I'd have to see if I think there might even within that be two forms, which is partially driven. There's one form where I do think it is a more reactive and impatient or uncontrollability, and others it is a kind of, there is something that initially is about demonstrating power, and I think that's a different kind of, so there might be a third in that, that ends up producing the same effects of instability, but is actually not taken with the same kind of, yeah.
We have a question, and then Vishaka. Maybe I can take, should I take two or three questions?
Yes, and I'll be quick, I'll be slower.
If you could just introduce yourself, please.
Yeah.
Sorry, so my name is David Silverberg. I'm a Ph.D. student in the Religion Department. Thank you, this was very interesting and generative, and I'm trying to think through a couple things. So I'm going to ask you what I think will probably sound like an incredibly naive question, and I'll try to hedge it a little bit. In the sort of means and ends relation that you laid out to us, why is violence or nonviolence such a central problematic within that? And I know that sounds like a silly question, and the reason I ask this is because, for instance, as you drew our attention to within the socialist movement more broadly, or within various anti-imperialist struggles in the same time period, we have lots of conversations about means and ends, but they don't necessarily then become conversations about violence versus nonviolence, right? There's a sense that there's a distinct possibility of a prefigured kind of politics that could be violent, and that's not contradictory. And I also ask this specifically because in the kind of context of the British efforts to disarm the Rajput states, and I'm thinking particularly of like southwestern Rajasthan and northeastern Gujarat, I think there is good cause to believe that the conceptual valence of what violence meant was actually shifting quite a bit in this exact same time period. So for it to assume a centrality, I think there's something interesting happening. I'm not exactly sure what to make of it, but particularly, right, also in the period that you're talking about, these efforts from the British obviously start in the middle of the 19th century, but they don't really reach any kind of maturity until the early 20th century, right around the 1920s, when suddenly a lot of, what's the right word here, Rajasthani and Gujarati, let's call them Banyas, start all of a sudden being quite involved in converses of freedom struggle. So I'm just wondering how that stuff ties together.
Did you want to take this?
Vishaka, did you want to?
Yeah, slightly different question, so I don't know if we can get you somewhere else.
Would you like to?
I was
collect.
particularly interested as you started talking about, in the discussion about the means and ends of Swaraj, and that downgrading of the kind of top-down, disruptive, and bottom-up, and then you articulated three elements. Khadi was one, along with Hindu-Muslim, and then the untouchability removal of that. And it seemed that what got me going was that why Khadi was one that really so mobilized, and why not? And you just kind of made a passing reference towards the Hindu-Muslim that was actually something that Gandhi was frustrated by, or was it that he couldn't find it, or in fact the priority had gone one way, and therefore there was not the same kind of priority. So, or was it that Khadi was something that had the strategic imperative of going towards the Hind Swaraj as well, in a way that other two are much more internal and more, if you will, domestic consumption to get people going. So I'd love to know a little bit more granularity around the decision made and the action. And the second question is really, I was particularly interested in 1929 and then Dandi, 1930. How do you look at Dandi in terms of this means and end discussion?
Yeah. Okay. Let me see if I can be quick. Means and ends. So it is true that I think in general, in a general formulation, it is separate from questions of violence and nonviolence, and that's how I treated them. But I do think that Gandhi, obviously, so his, I think, account partially of I think in the first round of his critique of violence was not in Hind Swaraj was partially that violence as understood as a terrorist tactic was an elitist practice. It wasn't an account of mass struggle. So his initial critique of violence was both that it wasn't effective. It's a long philosophic and practical question, but also that it was not a mass technique. It could never be a mass technique. So obviously, but as you say, defenders of violence, even then, were talking about it in terms of its exemplarity and its a way as its ability to reform or realize a certain kind of lost agency. So that's always been a part of violence, that it has a kind of intrinsic defense. I think, but I do think, so I think Gandhi recognized that and therefore would emphasize the strategic failure of violence. That was a way to get around the fact that violence and nonviolence could be defended as, both people could defend it as resolving a problem of agency. Not entirely for Gandhi, because of course it does lead to unstable agency. It doesn't actually solve the problem. But so I think they are separable, and they're in this chapter I did separate them. But I think in the longer version I come back to the question of why violence is a central pivot around the mean. In a way, you can avoid it up to a point, but in the end, that's and it does depend ultimately. And the point I would end on, ultimately the question of means ends has to come down on what you take to be the efficacy of violence or force. And it's I think in Gandhi it's not up for grabs. I mean, there's a clear that point you have to question and undermine the claims of efficacy of force for a lot of on similar grounds on the psychology of violence. The question about Rajasthan and disarmament, I have to think about it. There is a lot of language about disarmament and facing up to being disarmed. So I think I had been thinking of it in an earlier moment, but I'd love to follow up on that, the coincidence of that, the policies. So the question of the Hindu, so I do think part of the reason, I don't think initially, so I think the constructive program, of course, I think before it was called the constructive program, Hindu Muslim unity, anti-untouchability, and Khadi were already on the platform in various ways before he started calling it officially. It was a part called initially, it was connected to Swadeshi, which was the pre-existing term, but he does drop that in favor eventually of this constructive program, I think partially to emphasize its structure about village level programs connected in this national project, which Khadi was easier. I think they are connected, though. I think the more he insists on Khadi more and more because of the failure of finding other solutions. So I think he thinks the Hindu-Muslim question is something he has failed on. So obviously the non-cooperation is also the Khilafat movement. He thinks Khilafat was this incredible opportunity and moment in which you could find a unifying symbol, an act, so that Hindus being able to support unconditionally Khilafat was this potential for a grand gesture that Hindus needed to do. But with various forms of various kinds of communal rioting that happened in the 20s especially, and the inability to either come to an agreement on how to quell those with the same allies that he had, I think he really felt like he couldn't find, he kept saying that he couldn't find the formula for Hindu-Muslim unity, what that unifying practice might be or campaign. And I think in the absence of that, he sometimes would insist that Qadi could make up for it. But I don't know if, and he would give examples of that, but I think sometimes the overemphasis on Qadi was a failure of other, but of course anti-untouchability, he did think that was a program that he did obviously insist on throughout the 30s as alongside but still separate from constructive program, because again it wasn't, there was something more local about the constructive program, and untouchability had another string. So,
It seems to me that untouchability and Qadi both have a performative piece.
Yeah, but I think that's what he was looking for. I think he couldn't find it. That was the issue. Is what would be the performative piece? Again, salt was. These were the things he could think of. But you see him not being able to find the answer for, again, Khilafat is the only one, and he remembers that as successful in not being able to find an alternative actual language for the acts of friendship he wanted Hindus to perform. So.
I think we had, if you can introduce yourself, and then David, and then Ravina.
I'm Astrid, I'm a senior in the politics department. I wondered, with the first relation of means and ends that you mentioned, where you have means as being the ends, or them being convertible, if he has anything on what happens when you become aware of that, because there seems to be a sense in which once you think that the means in themselves are sufficient, whatever you're doing, particularly if it's individualistic action of a certain sort, once you start thinking about it as sufficient, as all that you have to do, that becomes a possibility for you being lazy, docile, that in return that ends up actually breaking the convertible relationship that might have been there to start with. And I think it's particularly interesting because how we see now that the Hindu right has appropriated part of imagery surrounding Swayam Seva, Modi with the spinning wheel, where it becomes some sort of hollowed out, we just need to be engaging in some sort of service, and that becomes sufficient.
David?
I'm David Delleveld, and thank you for this very interesting paper. I want to talk more about the content of means and agency, and specifically, and it speaks to what Fran raised, the assignment of roles. Who gets to do what? And going back to the Gita, better to do your own duty badly than do someone else's duty well. And Gandhi appropriates to himself the leadership and spokesmanship for the Dalits. He appropriates it to himself fasting and so on. Leadership of temple entry in Kerala, for example, for a time. He takes on those roles, and he assigns very deliberately and very politically who gets, Nehru not Bosch for the presidency of the Congress and so on. So how does he think about the assignment of roles? Because that's really intrinsic to the content of means, it seems to me.
Finally, Ravina?
My question is actually related to the earlier one and to what Astrid, you were also saying. Does he think about the means? Does he ever refer in the examples that you've come across to the means without embodied action that is routinized and disciplined and is not special, like maybe you would train your body to be warriors, or it's not discursive, or it's not just mental and symbolic? So does he ever talk about the means outside the embodied practice space, or does he even talk about it in that sense?
Right. What, do you have something in mind? What?
It just seems like, it's a substitute for could you say that the means
Right.
then are about just everyday practice?
Yeah.
And
Yes,
it-
yeah.
And
Yeah.
anything outside that
Yes, okay.
is not meaningful.
Isn't that actually what Ambedkar critiqued him
Yes,
for?
yes.
That there was this
Yes,
kind of
that-
ritualistic
yes.
aspect in this, when he talked about sharir and the relevance of the body and
Exactly.
bodily discipline, and that was exactly what Ambedkar saw as the, the worst aspect of it, because it simply replicated the status quo and this kind of ritualized Hindu society.
Yeah. So let me see which way to go from here. So let me start with that question, and I think it does connect back to Astrid's. So I think there is a way in which I think he does. There are, even if you think of Kadi and the inward work it's supposed to do, there may be a way that he does think its ideal form is a kind of ritualized work. I think he always thinks it's demanding, because I think he always thinks we have passions that are always breaking that. So in a way, the first point I would say to Astrid is he's thinking of a self that isn't, it's like post-docility. So there is, so once you overcome it, you find yourself empowered. Then I think the constant worry he has is how to self-discipline that empowerment. So he isn't worried about falling back into docility, which might be the problem you're both mentioning. I think the Ambedkar critique, like Tagore's, is that Gandhi's emphasis on manual labor and the necessity for it is degrading at some level. It's not just it's going to repeat, of course, for former untouchables, it's idealizing a practice they want to be free from. And for Tagore, I think he also thinks that our goals should be about should not be limited to body, and it should be creativity in a fuller sense. And the creativity, so of course the critique both in different ways was Gandhi wanted to institute manual labor in schools, or have schools that are technical in various ways. So I think all of that is true, and I would only say at the same time, though, I think Gandhi's I don't think it was conservative, because of course it was really, his demand, as that Khadi franchise was he was trying to demand that elites take up the practice of labor, and that I think is still a radical. It's still a radical attempt to undermine the traditional Hindu separation and hierarchy of labor, and he wanted everyone to do their own especially of the most denigrating labor, and of course that's in the ashram and elsewhere. So I think in that way it was a radical critique of traditional notions of laboring, and he wanted to include labor and manual labor in, as we know, even in his ideal village democracy, it would be a labor franchise. Only those who labored for their bread could vote. So it was a deep commitment. It does mean that he did, and I think it was consistent with in a sense that he thought the future, it was alongside a sense that one needed to reject industrial society and move more towards forms of self-reliance and simplicity. And so it's opposite the Marxist and other ideas of technological improvement that could solve questions of equality. I think in some ways there's still something to Gandhi's point that if you really want the fulfillment of equality, then you have to completely deny or work against the division of labor, which I think on the other side, Ambedkar certainly, and I think rightfully wanted people to rise in the division of labor, but it wasn't ever clear that you could ever get rid of the division of labor. And I don't think even Ambedkar had a fully Marxistic. It just was a hope that more people, and you wouldn't be that certain classes wouldn't be stuck with that, and you would have a more rotation, but could never get rid of the hierarchy and division of labor. So
I think and then Jack.
So I have two questions. one's a hard one. So one is basically about the conservation of means, and this is a phrase that Gandhi uses over and over again. I was wondering, what do we make of that phrase? Is it possible to interpret it in a sort of mundane way and say that, well, maybe he's just talking about the fact that you should use the forms of political action more than once? So for example, the fast, use it over and over again. The march. So does conservation of means simply mean that, conserving the form of non-violent action? The other question was about spinning. Because you mentioned that there is a non-economic justification for spinning in his head. And I was wondering, is spinning for him a paradigmatic, a paradigm of non-violent action? Because it's slow, it's, you can't hurry, right? And clearly the result is not as important as the process. And so is the suggestion there that every activity in your life can be kind of turned into a practice like that? So because he does think that spinning is a yagya. And yagya for him is a perfectly detached action. So I was just wondering.
Let me see if I. So, do you want me to take another?
And Jack.
I wanted to hear more about Jack Hawley about spinning as well. What exactly does spinning involve? So you emphasize the slowness of the action. I've thought about its being sessile, so it is. It does not allow movement. It allows movement is radically external. I wondered if he writes about analogies between spinning and churning Mantena, and whether he sees a difference in that. In that one. There's one passage I'm thinking of where he says one should get up at 4 o'clock in the morning and spin. So does it have association with particular times of the day, with absence of sociality and being alone but involved in activity that will have utility beyond the self. I wonder what he thinks about, and that passage about 4 a.m. also has the movement of the clock. Here's the clock, very British thing actually. When he hears the clock in the background as he's thinking about spinning, well, what's that about? And then there's I wonder whether he wrote at all about the connection between, I don't even know enough about spinning to ask this question, between what the feet, are the feet involved in spinning at all?
It depends on the charka.
It does, okay. I wondered about hand to foot as in relation to hierarchies of the body. And then especially about imagination, which has come up in our conversation or enthusiasm. So what does Gandhi think is going on in the mind when spinning is occurring? I would just love to hear more of an exposition of this paradigmatic act and what it is.
Actually, may I just add to this and then can listen to you respond. But, it's actually this performative Swaraj that you referred to, which I was so fascinated by. Because one of the things that I kept thinking of as you were presenting this work is, in some ways, Gandhi is kind of caught in this very insular type of thinking. It goes back to what Lenny was asking about, who is he debating with? And it seems as if ultimately he is in conversation with himself and trying to work his way through this, problematic of means and end. And, many times it seems as if he's reached an impasse, that he really cannot move outside of that. Outside of this polarization. And it seems to me that this performative aspect is one of the ways, and I think Jack, and this idea of spinning and this slow pace of it, and how the mind is filled with other kinds of thoughts, that is performative Swaraj his answer to the resolution of the means and dilemma.
I mean, I think I'm happy to think very carefully about spinning, because I do think spinning is his ideal model of a practice that is nonviolence. I think that's right, and I think it's because it does all of, it solves it's exemplary of means end on all three grounds, but I think especially it is but I think as an inward practice, it is, he thinks of it as, because it requires concentration, you can't do it without concentration. So, and he gives a lot of examples of how you can't do it blindly. It requires intense focus, and it's because it requires intense focus that you also calm your other thoughts. So you're meant to, it is a kind of meditation, and that's what its function is. It's to bring you back to yourself. And so I think, so in that way, it is exactly, that's what it's doing to your thoughts. It's actually freeing you from your obsessions and hankering, which your other hankerings that your mind is doing. And it is, I think, very importantly, isolating. So even if it is a part of this collective practice, everyone is supposed to do it. Only half an hour, he'll keep saying when people complain, in half an hour, it's not that long. But it is, I think, to my mind, it is a kind of model of that perfectly, if you think of one ideal model of mass satyagraha is dispersed individual action. So it is collective action, but it's dispersed and I think radically isolated and radically isolating. It's meant to draw you inward. And I think the best example of Gandhi doing this work is when he did it on platforms. So he did it in the middle or during political meetings. And that was again a practice to calm himself during a meeting, but that's a performative display of this practice for a specific exemplary effect.
One more aspect, that the smartest person is not the best at it. A humble person who practices a lot quietly can do it much better than an urban intellectual.
Yeah, and traditionally it's a female practice, so it was supposed to be also a lot of the exemplary practices that Gandhi think of as ideal practices of service were gendered, traditionally female practices, and so I think that's also the inversion that he hopes to make. Are there other practices that do a similar work? I think I think probably Vivek, you're right that I haven't thought about churning, so I don't know, and I haven't seen references to it. So I have to think if Khadi is meant to be the ideal form that other practices would mimic those. So I have to think about that. But I think the question on conservation, I think there are two versions of it, because conservation, I think, goes back to the question of if you really take the excitement angle, then you're conserving energy as well. But also, I think I don't know if it's the same form, because I think you're also, the other language is cultivating, which is a conservation of seed, which also has all the seminal energy, and I don't think, not purposefully, it's the way Gandhi thinks. But I don't know, I don't think there are a limited number of forms in Gandhi, but I think, as we've talked about before, they have to be forms. So I think that is right, there's a formality to what satyagraha looks like in order for it to repeat itself. But I don't know if there is a limited number of forms in the armory of satyagraha. There are ones that he returns to, but I think they're inventions too. Hartal is an invention, and the performative, I think the question I'm avoiding is a big one that came up about leadership, and that David raised. I mean, personally, I think Gandhi is more interesting in the forms of mass satyagraha that he's enunciating, and I don't think that those are, and the means of political action on a mass scale, those may not be the same as reconcilable with all of his decisions about leadership, but I think in principle, even when he abuses or does not follow his own language in the Pune Pact or others about what satyagraha is supposed to look like and what a fast is supposed to look like, and the rule that he always says that a fast should never be for blackmail or felt as blackmail, clearly that was not lived up to, and he did, the only fast he ever apologized for or said he had done wrong was the Ahmedabad fast, the labor fast, where he knew that his fasting had brought the mill owners to the table. He said that was a false fast, or a false, not properly, but he never said that about the Pune Pact or the fast around it. So he could, I think, not fulfill the rules, but I don't think the rules, I don't think you could use Gandhian language or this language of means and ends to talk fully about the leadership struggles and the choice of Bose. There'd be other ways to justify the choice of Nehru over Bose, but I don't think he ever would use this language to justify those decisions. But to me, they are dilemmas. I don't think, I hesitate when I use performative because I don't mean it. I think there is a display element to Satyagraha in the sense that he talks about making the right effect and of having an effect or impact. And again, like Dhingra did not give his body in the right way. A martyr doesn't induce the right effect. That's not Satyagraha. But I wonder if the problem with performative also has the sense that it's untethered aestheticism or just aesthetic display. And I think, again, in his critique of speeches, it's precisely the idea that for them to be action, they have to be something more than display. They have to be connected to something, either it's a commitment of a certain kind or tethered to a more collective set of practices.
Just on that, sorry, could I just add on the Khadi part of it? I came across a reference to a 1929 machine contest for the Chakra that he announced. And I was reading that it wasn't really, so he was looking at technology.
He was always trying to improve the Charka.
As long as it's not dehumanized. Right? And of course, when you think of khadi, or when you think of the cloth, or if you think of, these are very essential part of the economy at the time. Right? If you think of empire and cotton, and so it's not just any symbol. It is the heart of the economic struggle in some ways. Right? So just in terms of technology.
I didn't answer your question. We'll have to answer it at the reception.
Yes, we can. Please do join us next door for a reception where we can continue some of these conversations. But in the meantime, please join me in thanking Karuna for this really wonderful, stimulating talk. Thank you so much. That was really so rich.
I was going to say more than you ever needed to hear about means and ends. You ever needed to hear. Oh my God, if I have to hear my...
this makes me feel, despite, how mercilessly Ambedkar pilloried Gandhi. I think he's some very interesting mind. Such an interesting thinker.
I think Ambedkar, I think to me, again, I think they represent clear, they have clear, there are clear dividing lines, but I don't think it means they are, that there's on every issue there's a clear triumph of one over another. They are addressing common questions with different answers.
But this was great. Thank you. This was really so stimulating.
But I think the reason that Ambedkar's star is rising and Gandhi's star is in such precipitous decline is that he couldn't get away from no one could be him after he died, because he was so eccentric in his judgments and so flexible and also so determined that things should go the way he decided they should go.
I thought it was, I often think the reason that Gandhi will always be on a decline is because he was too, at the moment he's too implicated in every debate. Everyone has to orient and fight against Gandhi's position on every debate. So I think there's no way for him not to be on a decline post-independence.
He'll have his innings later on again.
Maybe. I think contemporary India, like this moment in the protest, is the first time that any positive...
David,
of course.
I didn't mean to say that Gandhi was I was saying the issue of science, because if you think about any political process, who gets to do what, and how people take turns and all of that sort of thing. And I don't think that was really developed.
No, I think that's true. Yeah, I mean, I wondered though, see, I think the bigger problem, I think the very legitimate problem was the conformity. Because there were only limited practices, you could innovate practices. And then, but I don't know, I always think though, there is a kind of universality. He wants everyone to do everything.
The other one is the soul. That's a very good one. Although you could only do it so many times.
And there's a set pattern. Well, thank you for coming. Tiring, but that's just everything.
Did the lecture in Michigan for college?
It's good. I will send it. Not on my list. I will make sure. It's this year. It's taking place in April, and